I am Mary, and today I am going to tell you something that still feels unreal every time I think about it. And before I start, I want you to hit that subscribe button because we are getting so close to our goal, and your click will help me so much. And now listen carefully, because this is not just any story, this is the kind of story that makes you wonder how one small act can completely change your life forever. It started on a cold morning when I was rushing to get to work, and my hands were freezing. And my mind was already thinking about the long list of things I had to do that day. When I passed by the old station, I saw a man sitting on the ground, his clothes torn, his hair messy, and his face partly hidden by the shadow of his hood, and something about him made me slow down. It was not pity exactly. It was the way he was looking at me, not like he wanted something from me, but like he was studying me. I kept walking at first, but then I stopped and turned back. I do not know why, but I went inside the bakery on the corner, bought a sandwich, and walked back to where he was sitting. I held it out to him, and he took it with hands that were rough and cold, but instead of saying thank you, he looked me straight in the eye and said, "You do not know what you are doing, but this will come back to you in a way you cannot imagine." I froze for a second because his voice was calm, not like someone begging or complaining, more like someone giving a warning. I smiled awkwardly and left thinking maybe he was just saying something strange because he was tired or sick, but I could not shake off the feeling that his words were meant for me specifically. I kept replaying them in my mind during my shift, and the more I thought about it, the stranger it felt. Little did I know that in less than 12 hours I would see him again, and when I did, he would not be sitting on the ground anymore, and he would not be wearing torn clothes, and the place where I would see him again would make my heart race and my hands tremble, because that man, the stranger I had given my sandwich to, was not just anyone. He was the reclusive billionaire father of my fiancé, Daniel, and nothing about that meeting would happen the way you might think. You see, Daniel never talks much about his family, and I had always assumed it was just because they lived far away, or maybe they had different lifestyles. I never pushed him too hard to tell me more because our relationship was good, and I trusted him, but looking back, maybe I should have ask more questions, because the truth was already moving toward me like a wave ready to crash, and I had no idea how close it was getting. So here is what happened after I left the station that morning and went back to work. Daniel called me during my lunch break, which was unusual because he knows how busy I get in the middle of the day. He sounded excited and a little nervous, and he said, "I have someone I want you to meet tonight." And I remember asking who, and he paused for a moment and said, "You we'll see," and his tone was the kind that makes you both curious and worried at the same time. When my shift ended, he was already outside waiting in the car, and as soon as I got in, he started driving out of the city. I asked him where we were going, and he just smiled and said, "Trust me." We drove for almost an hour, the buildings turning into houses and then into open fields, until we reached a long driveway lined with tall trees. At the end of it stood a massive house, more like a mansion, with lights glowing through its tall windows. And when we stopped in front of it, my heart was beating faster, not because of the house, but because of the feeling that something important was about to happen. We walked to the door, and it opened before we could knock. A man in a dark suit greeted us and led us into a huge room with high ceilings and a fireplace crackling on the far wall. And there, standing by the fire, was the man from the station, except now his clothes were perfectly pressed, his hair combed, and his posture tall and confident. My breath caught in my throat as I recognized him, and I looked at Daniel expecting some kind of explanation, and he just said, "Mary, this is my father." Daniel said, "Mary, this is my father." And in that moment, my mind was trying to put together two completely different images: the man in front of me in his perfectly tailored suit and polished shoes, and the man I had seen just that morning sitting on the cold concrete with his hood pulled low over his face. I managed to smile, but I could feel my voice trembling as I said, "Nice to meet you, sir." And he gave me a slow nod with the smallest trace of a smile on his lips, but his eyes stayed locked on mine, like he was still studying me the same way he had earlier. Daniel seemed relieved that we were now inside and started talking about how long it had been since he had last visited, and I stood there letting my eyes wander around the room, the walls covered in paintings that probably cost more than my yearly salary, the shelves lined with old leather-bound books, the smell of wood smoke, and something faintly sweet in the air. This was nothing like the world I knew. My life until now had been simple. I worked in a small coffee shop, a cozy place with regular customers who liked to chat while I made their drinks. I rented a tiny apartment a few blocks away, and I was happy enough with what I had. It was not fancy, but it was mine, and that was enough. When I met Daniel 2 years ago, he came into the cafe on a rainy afternoon and ordered a black coffee and a blueberry muffin. We started talking that day, and somehow it felt like we had known each other forever. He was charming and kind, and never once did he treat me like I was less than him, even though it was clear from the start that he came from money, not the flashy kind, but the quiet kind, the kind you only notice in the way someone carries themselves. He never talked much about his family. Whenever I asked, he would give short answers like they live far away, or we are not that close, and I learned not to push the topic. Instead, we built our own little world together: dinners at small restaurants, late night walks in the park, movie nights on my couch where we would fall asleep halfway through the film he proposed 6 months ago in the same cafe where we met, and I said yes. Without hesitation, I loved him, and I thought I knew him well enough to spend my life with him. But standing in that mansion with his father watching me like he already knew something about me, I did not understand. I began to feel a crack in that certainty. Daniel started to lead me toward the dining room, and his father followed behind us. Silently, the table was long enough to seat 20 people, but only 3 places were set. The food was already waiting, and we sat down. Daniel tried to keep the conversation light, asking me about work and telling his father about our plans for the wedding, but his father hardly reacted. Instead, he kept turning the questions back to me, asking where I grew up, what my parents did, what my goals were in life. And every time I answered, he would nod slowly, like he was checking off a list in his mind. It was not the usual polite curiosity of a parent meeting a future daughter-in-law. It felt more like an interview, and every time I looked at him, I remembered his words from the morning: "You do not know what you are doing, but this will come back to you after dinner." Daniel excused himself to take a phone call, and I was left alone with his father. The room felt suddenly larger and quieter. He leaned back in his chair and said, "You gave me a sandwich today, you remember that?" And I nodded slowly. He smiled faintly and said, "Most people would have walked past without looking twice. You did not, and that says something about you." I asked why he had been there dressed like that, and he simply said, "Sometimes I like to see the world as it really is, not from behind these walls." He did not explain further, and before I could ask more, Daniel returned, and the moment was gone. The rest of the evening passed in polite conversation, but I could not shake the feeling that there was more going on under the surface. When we finally left the mansion, Daniel seemed relieved to be back in the car. I asked him why he had never mentioned his father, and he hesitated before saying, "We just have a complicated relationship, and I did not want to drag you into it." I wanted to believe him, but part of me kept thinking about the way his father looked at me, like he knew something I did not. The drive back was quiet, and when Daniel dropped me off, he kissed me goodnight, but his smile did not quite reach his eyes. That night, lying in bed, I replayed everything in my mind: the morning at the station, the dinner, the strange questions, and most of all, that feeling that something was about to happen, something that would change everything between me and Daniel and his father. I just did not know yet that the real test had not even started. The next morning, I woke up still thinking about that dinner, the questions his father asked, the way he looked at me like he was peeling back layers. I did not even know Daniel had left early for a meeting, so I went to work trying to shake off the unease. But by mid-afternoon, my phone buzzed. It was Daniel asking if I could come to the mansion again that evening. He sounded more tense than before. When I asked why, he simply said, "My father wants to see you." I thought it was strange that he did not invite Daniel too, but I agreed out of curiosity. When I arrived, the same man in the dark suit opened the door and led me to a smaller room. This time it was cozy, with bookshelves lining the walls and a large desk by the window. Edward was standing there, not in a suit but in a sweater and slacks, looking more relaxed, but still holding that same piercing gaze. He gestured for me to sit, and then he sat across from me, resting his hands on the table. "Mary," he said, "yesterday was an introduction. Today I want to have a real conversation, and I want you to listen more than you speak." I nodded, unsure what to expect. He began to tell me that his family had been in business for generations, that wealth had been passed down like an heirloom, and that with it came power and enemies. He told me he had chosen to live away from the public eye because most people wanted something from him, and that living as a recluse allowed him to see who people really were. But then his tone shifted, and he said, "But you are different because you did not know who I was, and you helped me anyway. And that is rare in my world." I started to thank him, but he held up a hand. Not done yet. He leaned in and said, "Daniel is a good man in some ways, but there are things about him you do not know. And before you marry him, I want you to know the truth." I felt my stomach tighten. I asked what he meant, and he told me that Daniel had been involved in some dangerous business dealings, that he had made mistakes that could cost him everything. I wanted to defend Daniel, but Edward's voice was steady and calm, like someone who had rehearsed this many times. He said, "I am not telling you this to hurt you. I am telling you this to protect you." Then he made a proposal: spend 1 week here at the mansion without Daniel, see the world from my perspective, and at the end of that week, I will show you something that might change how you see him forever. I was caught off guard, and I told him Daniel would never agree to that. Edward smiled faintly and said, "Daniel does not need to know." That was the first moment I realized how much control this man had. He could bend situations to his will without raising his voice, without making threats. I asked him why he was doing this, and he said, "Because I have seen too many people marry into this family for the wrong reasons, and I will not let that happen again. You have one chance to prove to me that your love for my son is stronger than your desire for what comes with his name." His words hung in the air, Heavy and sharp, I could feel the weight of what he was offering and what it might cost to accept. I told him I needed to think about it, and he said take your time, but not too much because some decisions cannot wait forever. When I left the mansion that night, my mind was spinning. Daniel was waiting for me outside my apartment. He asked what had happened, and I lied, telling him we just had tea and talked about the wedding. He seemed relieved, but I could see the worry in his eyes. I did not sleep that night. I kept turning Edward's words over in my mind, thinking about the way he spoke about Daniel, the way he seemed so sure there was more to the story than I knew, and the strange part was that despite the discomfort, despite the risk, a part of me wanted to know what that truth was. The next morning I called Edward and told him I would accept his proposal. I could hear the satisfaction in his voice as he said, "Good, then we begin tomorrow." The following day, I packed a small bag, telling Daniel I was going to visit a friend from out of town. I hated lying to him, but I could not risk him knowing what I was about to do. When I arrived at the mansion, Edward was waiting at the front steps, dressed casually again, but his presence still felt heavy. He led me inside and said, "For the next week, you will see how this family really works, and you will face situations that will test who you are." When no one is watching, I followed him through a series of hallways until we reached a room unlike anything I had seen before. It was filled with monitors showing live feeds from cameras all over the property, some inside, some outside. He pointed to a chair and told me to sit. He explained that the cameras were not just for security, they were for observation. He studied the behavior of every person who entered this house, guest, staff, even his own son. I asked him why, and he said because people reveal themselves when they think no one is looking. Then he turned off the monitors and told me we were going for a drive. The car took us into the city and stopped in a part one rarely visited. The streets here were crowded, noisy, and a little dangerous. Edward handed me an envelope and said inside is $500. You can do whatever you want with it, but by the end of the day, I will know exactly what you chose. I opened my mouth to ask how, but he simply said I have my ways and walked away, leaving me standing there alone. The test felt strange. I wandered through the streets wondering if he wanted me to give the money away, to keep it, to spend it. I passed a woman sitting on the curb holding a sign that said hungry, and without thinking I gave her $50. She smiled and thanked me, and I kept walking feeling a small sense of relief. I bought lunch for myself, then stopped at a bookstore where I found a novel I had been meaning to read. I hesitated before spending the money, but decided it was harmless. By the end of the day, I had spent about $100 and kept the rest. When I returned to the mansion, Edward was waiting in the study. He asked me to sit, and without looking at the envelope, he said, "You helped someone today. You also helped yourself. You kept most of the money, which tells me you are cautious but not afraid to be generous when it feels right." I asked how he knew, and he just smiled, saying, "I told you I have my ways." The next day, the test changed. He told me I would be joining a meeting with some of his business associates, and I was to listen closely. Without speaking, the meeting was intense. The men at the table discussed millions of dollars in deals with a calmness that made my head spin. There were hints of shady dealings, but nothing said outright. I could see why Edward wanted me there. It was a different world, one where trust was a currency and loyalty could be bought. As we left, he asked me what I thought, and I told him it felt like everyone was speaking in code. He nodded and said that is because they were on the third day. He had me join the kitchen staff for lunch service. I wore an apron and helped serve food to the employees instead of eating with Edward. It felt odd, but I noticed how the staff relaxed around me. Some told me stories about working here, others gave me subtle warnings about trust. The week continued with different tests, some obvious, like choosing between personal comfort and helping someone else, others more subtle, like noticing details in conversations or spotting lies. On the seventh day, Edward invited me to the library. He poured 2 glasses of wine and said, "You have done better than I expected. Most people fail before the 3rd day, but you surprised me." Then his tone grew serious, and he said, "Tomorrow, I will show you the truth about Daniel, and when I do, you'll have to make a choice that will change everything." The next day, I woke with a mix of dread and curiosity, knowing that whatever Edward was about to tell me could change everything about Daniel and our future. I met Edward in the study again, where he began to speak in a low, measured voice about the darker parts of the family business. He said Daniel was not as innocent as I thought, that there were secrets hidden behind the charm and smiles. Edward showed me photos of Daniel at parties with people who looked dangerous, men with cold eyes and expensive suits, men who whispered in corners and exchanged briefcases full of money. He told me about debts and failed deals, about friendships that were more about power than trust. Each story made me question what I knew about Daniel and who he really was. But Edward was careful not to push me too hard. Instead, he left pieces of information for me to connect on my own. He also shared stories from his own life, how he had lost everything once, how betrayal had cost him dearly, and how he had chosen to live apart from the world to protect what little he had left. But then came the biggest shock. Edward told me that years ago Daniel had been involved in a scandal, a financial misstep that had nearly destroyed the family reputation. The details were vague, but enough to make me shiver. He said Daniel had lied to protect himself, and that some people in the family never forgave him. I asked Edward why he was telling me all this, and he said, "Because you need to know what you are marrying into." And because I wanted to. See if you were strong enough to face the truth and stand by my son no matter what. I felt torn. I loved Daniel, but the idea that he had hidden so much from me stung deeply. I wondered if the man I knew was just a mask, and if I was about to marry a stranger. Edward watched me closely, as if reading my thoughts. He then handed me an envelope thicker than the last one, and said, "Inside are documents that will show you the truth about Daniel." I looked at him in disbelief, and asked if I should open it now. He smiled sadly and said, "That is your choice, but once open there is no going back." I left the mansion that day, my mind racing with doubts and fears. I wanted to believe Daniel was innocent, but Edward's stories lingered like shadows in the corners of my mind. I decided to wait before talking to Daniel, and tried to keep my feelings hidden, but the secret weighed heavily on me. That night, I finally called Daniel and told him I needed to see him. He agreed to meet the next day, and when we sat down, I confronted him gently about the stories and the documents. I told him about Edward's warnings and the envelope. He looked at me with pain in his eyes and denied everything firmly, saying that his father was bitter and manipulative, that the scandal had been exaggerated, and that Edward was trying to drive a wedge between us. He said he loved me and wanted to prove it, and that he would never hide anything from me again. But despite his words, a seed of doubt had been planted between us, and I knew that things would never be quite the same. When I returned to Edward, he was waiting with a knowing look and said, "Now the real test begins." After my conversation with Daniel, I felt a whirlwind of emotions: confusion, anger, and sadness. I kept replaying his words in my head, that his father was manipulative and bitter, that the scandal was exaggerated, but I could not ignore the nagging feeling that there was more beneath the surface, something he was not telling me. The next day, I decided to confront Daniel again. I met him at our favorite cafe, a place filled with memories and laughter. But that day the air between us felt heavy. I looked into his eyes and said, "Daniel, I need you to be honest with me. No secrets, no lies, whatever it is, I want to know." He hesitated, his jaw tight, and then slowly, he began to open up. He told me about the pressure from his family, how his father controlled everything even from afar, how the scandal years ago had shattered their relationship, and how he had tried to distance himself from the darker parts of the business. He admitted mistakes, but swore he was trying to be better. He said he wanted to build a life with me based on truth and trust, but that meant confronting his past and the family. I listened carefully. Part of me wanted to believe him completely, but another part remained wary. I asked him why he never told me these things before, and he said he was afraid of losing me, afraid that the truth would push me away. That was when I saw a crack in his armor, of vulnerability I had not expected. I reached out and took his hand and said, "Daniel, whatever happens, we will face it together, but I need you to promise me honesty no matter how hard it gets." He nodded and squeezed my hand. The moment felt fragile but real. As we talked, the phone buzzed. I glanced down and saw a message from Edward. It said, "Meet me tonight at the mansion." I looked at Daniel, who raised an eyebrow and shrugged, saying, "Maybe the final piece of the puzzle is waiting for us." I agreed, and that night we returned to the mansion. Edward was waiting in the grand hall, his expression unreadable. He motioned for us to sit, and then with a calm voice, he said, "I have been watching both of you, testing your loyalty, your love, and your honesty. This is not just about business or money. It is about trust between family." He pulled out a thick folder and placed it on the table. Inside were documents, photos, even recorded conversations that implicated Daniel in a scheme to defraud business partners. I looked at Daniel, searching his face for any sign of guilt or innocence. He looked back, steady, but his silence was louder than words. Edward then said, "This is your choice to make. You can stand by your son and fight, or walk away and protect yourself." The room was heavy with tension, and I realized that this moment would define everything from that day on. Daniel and I were no longer just two people in love. We were partners facing a storm together, but I also knew that the path ahead would not be easy, and that trust once broken was hard to rebuild. The tension in the room was thick as Edward laid out the documents, photos, and recordings that supposedly proved Daniel's guilt. I stared at the papers, feeling overwhelmed, unsure if what I saw was real or just another manipulation. Edward watched me carefully, as if waiting for my reaction. Daniel remained silent, his face unreadable. I looked into his eyes, searching for a hint of confession, but found only calm defiance. Then Edward made a move that shocked me. He reached over and tore the documents to pieces, sending papers fluttering to the floor. He looked at us both and said, "None of this is real. It was a test, a game to see if you both had what it takes to survive in this family, to be honest, loyal, and strong." I was stunned, unable to speak. Daniel let out a breath and smiled faintly, saying, "I knew from the start my father was testing us all along." Edward nodded and said I needed to be sure that Mary loved Daniel for who he was and not for what he could give her, and that Daniel was ready to face the consequences of his past together, I looked at Daniel and saw the man I fell in love with, not the man in those papers, and I realized that sometimes the truth is not in documents or accusations, but in the choices we make when faced with darkness. Edward then stood and said, "Now that you have passed my test, I am ready to welcome you both fully into this family and to offer my support for your future." The weight that had been pressing on me began to lift, and I felt a strange sense of relief mixed with hope. Edward smiled and said, "Remember, everything started with a simple sandwich, a small act of kindness that led us here and changed all our lives forever." I looked at Daniel, took his hand, and knew that whatever came next, we would face it together, stronger than before. After Edward tore up the documents and declared it all a test, I felt a mixture of relief and disbelief. It was hard to process that everything I had feared was just a game to prove our loyalty to the family. Daniel and I looked at each other, and in that moment, I realized how much we had been through together, how much we trusted each other despite the doubts and fears. Edward stepped closer and said, "I know this has not been easy for either of you, but now that you have passed my challenge, I am ready to support your future and rebuild what was broken." I saw a softness in his eyes that I had never noticed before, and it made me believe that maybe this reclusive billionaire was not just a man testing others, but someone who had been hurt deeply and was looking for trust too. Daniel smiled and said, "Thank you, Father," and I knew then that whatever the past held, the future was ours to write. We left the mansion that night hand in hand, and as we drove away, the city lights seemed brighter, the possibilities endless. I thought back to the moment I gave that man a sandwich on a cold morning, never imagining that simple act would lead me here, a test of love, trust, and family, all because of kindness and courage. And now I want to ask you, what would you have done if you were in my place? Would you have accepted the challenge or walked away? Do you believe in second chances? Let me know in the comments. I love reading your stories and thoughts. And if you like this video, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel. We have many more stories like this. And if you want to keep watching, there is another video appearing on your screen right now. Just click it and I will see you there. Thank you for listening. And until next time, stay kind and stay strong.